This week, we had the release of DeepSeek, a large language model released by a Chinese startup that kind of shook up the whole market, blew up the internet because this model is performing at or above state-of-the-art levels comparative to models like OpenAI's. It is fully open source and has many variants in smaller forms that you can run yourself. Their pricing in their API is somewhere along the lines of 10x cheaper than what you're going to find for pricing with OpenAI and other competitors. So this really shook things up in a big way. The capital markets were aware of this. Nvidia ended up dropping like 17% on Monday. All the big tech companies really took a hit, big US tech companies for the most part, because the dominance was questioned, whether they were really leading this space now. I want to dive into a few things just to give you an overview of DeepSeek, how it benchmarks, what the setup is, why I think this is actually really exciting, and why this is going to lead to more LLMs, more LLM development, and also how this has changed the perspective on where the value is in the AI market. Here we have the GitHub for DeepSeek R1, their largest model. I'll pull up the data shortly, but it's somewhere along the lines of like 260 billion parameters, 37 billion active parameters. So a very large model, but the active parameters make a big impact on the cost of inference and actually querying the model. And here we can see this is the performance versus OpenAI O1, O1 Mini, some other versions of DeepSeek. And we can see here's R1 here, best in class, second best, best in class, second best, best in class. We have coding, mathematics, other benchmarks, and this is basically the story for the model, is that it's dominating these performance categories. And this really obviously shook things up because this came out of left field that this model is performing better than OpenAI's O1. And not only that, it's open source. And so this model has many variants now being open source that are coming out on Hugging Face for running locally. You had distilled models, which is basically a smaller version of the larger model. So then you can run it on a smaller machine. So they have a 1.5 billion parameter, 7B, 8B, 14, 32, and 70B. You can run these on your own desktop computer in some cases, or your own AI desktop computer, depending on how many params you want to run. You're going to need a lot of RAM to run that. Here we have another breakdown comparing against some of the main models. Gemini here, we have Claude, Sonnet here, really some of the leaders across the board. And here we have R1. So we can see R1 performing basically second best across the board on these metrics, which is really impressive. Actually, amazing to me that Sonnet performs so much worse on these metrics, because I find Claude to be the best developer experience still. All right, and then this graphic here covers what I was talking about, pricing. So this is why people are also blown away by this, is that their API pricing is just a fraction of what we're seeing other models charging for their pricing. So anyone who's really cost sensitive, this is a great alternative. But that being said, there's obviously been lots of concerns raised around the data privacy here. Personally, I wouldn't say OpenAI is the person you should trust with your data either. But the really exciting thing about R1 is that you can take this model and you can host it yourself, as I already said. So you can build out that internal LLM and keep all of your data secure and private, so that all of those conversations are owned and controlled by you. All of that data is controlled by you and your company. So if I quickly summarize my takeaways from DeepSeek, I would say now we have a cutting edge open source model that we can use that's on par with O1 and other top models, Gemini. We have distillations in many different sizes that we can use. Llama was the go-to alternative for that. Now we have this to work with as well in the open source space. If you're interested and not worried about your data, you have an API option that is 10x cheaper than any other options for the level of performance and accuracy. There was a lot of talk about the technical innovation here, how many chips were used. This is highly speculative, and it does look, based on the amount of NVIDIA's revenue that comes from Singapore, it was very overblown the amount of chips that were used to train this is likely much more than reported. So that was another interesting insight for me. And then finally, I would say a main takeaway from this is that the real pricing power and business value is not centered with the models potentially. Still early days to say this, but it looks more and more like the foundational models are going to be commoditized, and we are going to have the value at the application layer, which when you look at the history of computing is exactly what you would expect. Early on in the CPU days, the value was to Intel, to the chip makers, and then it shifted to the application layer of Microsoft, Apple, who were able to capture most of the value and build sustained business moats in these industries.
I think one important issue that you mentioned was the data privacy concern. So people who are very data conscious, but who might not be as fluent in the tech world, this might be a problem for DeepSeek. Personally, for example, I don't use Chinese apps at all. As well, when Timo was introduced, TikTok, and now we have DeepSeek. For me, this is shying away to use it only because of this one primary concern that I have. As you mentioned before, OpenAI isn't that much better, but then it's just a matter of who would you trust more to have your data. And I think that might be a critical constraint for others as well, especially in Europe.
I agree. Ultimately, I do hand over a lot of my data to ChatGPT with my personal queries in OpenAI. I don't expect them to be keeping all that data private. I'm sure they're using it for understanding and seeing what they can do to market with it. But like you said, it's a different step to give your data to a Chinese company that is making many people slow down to try out this app. It did become the #1 app on the App Store. So obviously a lot of people are playing with this, but especially for business use cases, more sensitive data, really long-term use, people who are conscious about this, I agree that this will be a major concern. Ultimately, I'm excited about this model getting released. I think this is a win for the open source community and being able to build and deploy your own models. It seems like the value is not necessarily going to be in the foundational models right now. This is going to lead to even more work being done with AI. We used to have mainframe computers, and then we created desktop computers and personal computers, and that exploded computing. I think the more we can bring these models closer to users' devices, the more it's going to lead to more demand and more growth in the industry. Super exciting.